At the outset, I would like to apologize for the length of this video. It's probably going to run 45-50 minutes. The video itself is a condensation of a collection of small essays that you will find on the website www.ecofascism.com. That's www.ecofascism.com, under an article heading called Jorge Bergoglio's Green Encyclical. A word about sources. In the interest of brevity, I am not going to be discussing source material in this video. If you want more information about the sources, go to the website ecofascism.com and look up the Jorge Bergoglio Green Encyclical document. It's extensively footnoted, probably around 60 footnotes in total. And there's about 24 books and journal articles and archives and databases listed in the bibliography there. So if you have issues about the sources, and this is highly controversial stuff, a lot of misinformation has been released about this topic, so it's good to give that a look. But that said, let's get started. More than any other surviving institution, the Catholic Church bears responsibility for the crimes of fascism committed between the years 1919 and 1945. In Austria, Spain, Croatia, France, Slovakia, and other places, the Catholic Church didn't merely turn a blind eye. It was fascism's full partner. Austrian and Slovakian fascism was theocratic. Croatian and Spanish priests organized massacres. Popes blessed both Mussolini's Africa campaign and Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. Seeking redemption for these sins, Pope John XXIII in 1962 launched the Second Vatican Council. This introduced sweeping liberalizations and modernizations in the Church. This was the time of groovy priests and nuns with folk guitars. The Second Vatican Council also created opportunities for leftists within the Church. 1968 witnessed both an open letter to Pope Paul VI signed by 1,500 anti-poverty priests and a like-minded conference in Medellin. Liberation theology priests set up parishes in slums. They organized unions and co-ops. Catholic elites and the CIA configured liberation theology to be the slippery slope to socialism. Pope Paul VI appointed an Opus Dei cardinal as his liberation theology scourge. In Europe, opposition to liberation theology remained ideological and bureaucratic. In Latin America, it turned violent. Between 1965 and 1985, some 2,000 leftist priests and nuns were killed, imprisoned, or tortured for their beliefs. Although caricatured as the rifle-toting padres, liberation theology priests very rarely advocated armed struggle. On the other hand, the Banzer Plan, as put forward by Bolivian dictator Hugo Banzer, and which was adopted by 10 other Latin American countries, recommended discrediting liberation theology in part by planting revolutionary communist literature on leftist priests. Resistance to liberation theology within the Argentine church's foremost intellectual order, the Jesuits, was led by Jorge Bergoglio. As San Miguel's dean of philosophy, he fired progressive professors and he banned the teaching of liberation theology. In 2001, Pope John Paul II rewarded Jorge by making him a cardinal. In 2005, Bergoglio became the president of the Argentine Bishops Association and hence the highest cleric within Argentina. Bergoglio's subsequent election as pope thus capped a 50-year struggle whereby reactionaries within the church overturned the Second Vatican Council. Earlier, Pope John Paul II had appointed Cardinal Ratzinger as his prelate for the doctrine of the faith, also known as the Universal Inquisitor, to discipline clergy and theologians. Cardinal Ratzinger held that position for 24 years before becoming Pope Benedict XVI. Between the two of them, Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI, there was a purge of the higher rankings of the Church of anyone associated with liberation theology, and there was the elevation of a network of like-minded cardinals who elected Bergoglio as Pope, Pope Francis, in 2013. A bit of Argentine history. More than any other Latin American church, the Argentine church supported its dictators. During the 1930s dictatorship of Jose Uriburu, the Argentine bishops extolled fascism as the holy ideology, and they denounced liberalism as the product of what they called the pagan English-speaking world. The Argentine bishops preached of the coming penitential hour, where there would be the wholesale slaying of the godless. It was into this political manger that Jorge Bergoglio was born, unto staunch Catholic Italian immigrants to Argentina. After the 1943 coup d'etat in Argentina, Colonel Juan Perón first consolidated his power within the government and then had himself elected popularly as the president of Argentina. Simultaneous to these events, mid-1940s, late 1940s, some 5,000 Axis war criminals slipped into Argentina. Many of them were Germans, many of them brought considerable wealth, many of them came with Vatican-supplied passports. President Juan Perón's base was deeply split between the right Peronists, who were primarily an expression of the old money, the oligarchy, the wealthy landowning latifundia, and the left Peronists, who were primarily the trade union movement, and they were based in the nationalized industries and in the civil service. A coup d'etat in 1955, at the behest of the right Peronists, began with Navy jets bombing a left Peronist rally, killing 300. Perón fled to Spain. Post-1955 Argentina was rife with neo-Nazi propaganda, and there was a great proliferation of Catholic fascist clubs. This was the political environment in place when young Jorge first entered a prestigious Jesuit college. The Catholic fascist club Takura, which took its name after a type of spear, developed from the standard practice of priests recruiting high school students. The co-founders of Takura were Alberto Escura and Joe Baxter, and we will meet them both later. These two men would give straight-arm salutes every time they walked past the church. Takura claimed to fight capitalism and Zionism with one hand and communism with the other. For all Takura members, violence was obligatory. Before the group fractured and came apart in the early 1960s, they numbered between 5,000 and 7,000. Early 1960s Argentina spawned another Catholic fascist group. This one took the name Argentine Iron Guard, after the macabre Romanian Iron Guard, whose anti-liberal, anti-democratic views they shared. A French Catholic fascist group also joined the milieu. La Cité Catholique was closely allied with the extremely violent secret armed organization of France, the leadership of which Charles de Gaulle lined up in front of firing squads. Many of the fugitives of that repression fled once again to Argentina. They were shepherded into Argentina by a soldier monk who ran La Cité Catholique's Buenos Aires chapter. He was also a lecturer at the Argentine Navy's Mechanics School. The Argentine admirals loved La Cité Catholique's depiction of subversion as being this shape-shifting devil sliding through history that was best combated by preemptive strikes. There were elections again, national elections in 1958. They were set aside by another coup d'etat in 62. There were elections again in 63. They were set aside by a coup d'etat in 66. The junta which took power in 66 took the repression to a new level. They criminalized short skirts on women. They criminalized long hair on men. They basically prohibited any form of democratic activism in the country. That was the political environment wherein Jorge Bergoglio studied to become a priest. He was ordained Father Bergoglio in 1969. He was almost immediately selected by certain bishops within the church to undergo further grooming in Spain. He spent the years 1971 and 1972 at the University of a.k.a. in Spain, which was an Opus Dei controlled university. Opus Dei is this still existing, powerful political cult within Catholicism. It was founded in 1928 primarily through the support of the Bishop of Madrid. When Franco consolidated power in Spain, the Generalissimo handed almost all of Spain's educational infrastructure over to Opus Dei. When Jorge Bergoglio got off the plane in Spain, he was entering a country where 10 out of 19 cabinet members were Opus Dei. Stellar reviews from such men earned Bergoglio a promotion when he returned to Argentina. He was appointed the Master of Novices within the Argentine Catholic Church. Simultaneously to that, Bergoglio became the spiritual advisor to the aforementioned neo-Nazi organization, Argentine Iron Guard. In the early 1970s, an Italian neo-fascist cabal known as Propaganda 2, or P2, entered the Argentine scene. This group had led a failed coup d'etat in Italy in 1970. During the 1970s, their main doctrine was known as strategy of tension. The plan was to foment or instigate a wave of fascist terror and a corresponding counterwave of false flag or fake left-wing terror strikes, with the hope that the bulk of the Italian public would become so frightened they would welcome a coup d'etat if it appeared to be being led by the mainstream security services. Despite having the support of 195 Italian military officers and several intelligence executives, and over 100 notables, the 1970 Borghese coup failed. Thereafter, Propaganda 2 concentrated its efforts on Argentina, where 11 Propaganda 2 inductees would hold senior executive positions. Notably among them was, of course, Colonel Juan Perón. Perhaps more important was the Italian-Argentine Admiral Emilio Massera, who in the early 1970s received these battlefield promotions within the Argentine Navy up to the position Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. It was Admiral Emilio Massera who supplied the Propaganda 2 masterminds with the necessary visas and documentation they needed to set up shop in Argentina. There were elections in March of 1973. This produced a mainly left Peronist government. They welcomed back Juan Perón from exile, and they faithfully and unwittingly appointed a Propaganda 2 man to be the Minister of National Welfare. His name was Jose Lopez Riga. He immediately set about shunting large amounts of public monies towards his own and a new fascist organization called Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or AAA. A lot of the Tacura alumni and members of other neo-fascist groups in Argentina flocked into AAA. they vowed to kill all the leftists, gays, and Jews in Argentina. June 1973, Perón returns from exile. 3 million Argentines show up at the airport to greet him. Unbeknownst to them, in the grandstand at the front of the festivities, AAA has got several marksmen built right into the grandstand. Before Perón speaks, they open fire on leaders of the left Peronist movement who are at the front of the crowd. Dozens of people are killed, hundreds of people are wounded. Argentina slips further into crisis. A few weeks after that event, some key bishops from inside the Argentine church fly to the Vatican. There, they successfully lobby the Vatican into firing the head of the Argentine Jesuits, the provincial superior of the Jesuits, who was pro-liberation theology. He was fired and he was replaced by, you guessed it, Jorge Bergoglio. Provincial Superior Bergoglio dashed about Buenos Aires in gold-embroidered velvet vestments. He insisted on limousine rides for the shortest of trips. He imposed rigid schedules and pre-Second Vatican Council dress codes. He layered Jesuit publications with anti-liberation theology articles. He opposed slum parishes or any other type of collective self-help for the poor. Soup kitchens were okay, tenants groups, anti-poverty groups, not okay. After Perón's re-election, Perón immediately purged his left-wing faction out of his party and out of his government. He then dies. On July 1st, 1974, his wife Isabel Perón becomes the nominal president of Argentina. The de facto behind-the-scenes president was José López Rega. He unleashes his AAA. They would ultimately commit 1,500 political assassinations. In the summer of 1974, AAA committed 220 bombings, murders, and rapes. They were committing a political assassination on average every 19 hours. They were aided and abetted in this wave of terror by their comrades in arms, the Argentine Iron Guard. In this very summer of 1974, with this fascist terror campaign at a fever pitch, Provincial Superior Bergoglio transferred one of 3 Jesuit-controlled universities, the University of Salvador in Buenos Aires, to the Argentine Iron Guard. 10 Iron Guard leaders assumed senior positions within the university, including their chief of staff, who became the rector of the entire university. Argentines were stunned. There was no mystery as to who the Argentine Iron Guard was, and he was handing an entire university to them. The official myth, according to, or in keeping with, Propaganda II's strategy of tension doctrine, was that the Argentine military were haplessly buffeted between extreme left and extreme right terror campaigns. The extreme leftists, according to the official narrative, were 2 groups, the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army. There were some lesser ones. These groups did in fact commit hundreds of kidnappings and were responsible for a few thousand fatalities, if one counts servicemen killed in combat. The Montoneros, however, are not properly categorized as a radical leftist and certainly not as a Marxist organization. The bulk of their membership were Catholic student activists, Catholic trade unionists. They represented the democratic center in Argentina, who had been denied proper elections since at least 1955, and who had been denied basic civil liberties for at least as long. That is why they took up arms in the late 1960s. The People's Revolutionary Army, or the ERP, were a false flag operation. Their leader was Joe Baxter, who you will recall was the co-founder of the neo-Nazi organization Chocura, This was a man who in the early 60s would write lengthy poems praising Adolf Hitler. He quit Tacura in 1962 and joined the Right Peronists. The Right Peronists sent Baxter to Spain in 1964 to have a couple of face-to-face meetings with Colonel Juan Perón. Somehow during these meetings, Baxter converts to communism. He then flies to Vietnam. He does a quick tour of duty with the Viet Cong to gain leftist creds. He then flies back to Argentina. Somewhere along the way, he improbably converts to Trotskyism, and even more improbably converts to a rural guerrilla formation of Trotskyism, none of which is believable. Baxter himself ultimately perishes as the result of a bizarre fire aboard a commercial airline flight to Paris, presuming that was in fact Baxter's body found burned beyond recognition. The ERP tactic of setting off bombs in movie theaters was a tactic that is unknown to the radical left, even their armed insurgent formations. However, it was textbook propaganda 2 strategy of tension doctrine. When the repression came, the ERP's urban cells were rounded up in the matter of a week or two, which suggests a high degree of state infiltration. Their rural insurgency was a predictable fiasco. They were fairly quickly routed by the army, and when the army did rout them, they found a lot of not particularly political foreign mercenaries in these camps. The timeline is important here. The insurgency, such as it was effectively defeated by February of 1975. That is when Isabel Perón issues her annihilation decrees, which was a move even the New York Times called a step into full-blown fascism. Hence, before the famous March 1976 coup, Argentina already had thousands of political prisoners, and there were systematic warrantless executions of those prisoners going on inside the jails before the March 24, 1976 coup, when the generals gently ousted Isabel Perón off the throne. General Videla became the president. Admiral Emilio Massera became torturer-in-chief. Between 1976 and 1979, this junta perpetrates one of the worst crimes against humanity, one of the most violent acts of state terrorism that we've seen in a Western country in modern times. Internal documents from the junta have them referring to the repression as the process, capital T, capital P. However, informally, the perpetrators of this process referred to it as the dirty war. It's important to remember that that was a phrase originating with the perpetrators of these crimes. A dirty war is a sinister misnomer. Wars justify killing. Wars offer defenses to prosecution. There was no war in Argentina. The resistance never controlled national territory, never obtained recognition of belligerency, never received significant aid from a foreign power, and never obtained broad popular support. Only a tiny percentage of the junta's victims were the armed communist revolutionaries of authorized lore. The victims included police chiefs, judges, union leaders, lots of those, professors, doctors, parliamentarians, lawyers, human rights activists, and family members of all of the above. In March of 1976, about 1,000 or so members of the Anti-Communist Alliance and related neo-fascist and neo-Nazi groups were given honorary ranks within the military. They were integrated in with some highly politicized commando groups, primarily in the Navy and Marines. The military in general created 340 detention centers, secret detention centers, across Argentina. In March of 1976, these few thousand men from these various, these deputized neo-fascists and these politicized commandos then undertake what Hitler called the night and fog strategy. They all don civilian clothing, look as nonchalant as possible. They drive about in small squads in civilian cars, unmarked cars. And they, as surreptitiously as possible, start to abduct people and take them to these detention centers where rape, torture, murder are ubiquitous. In total, about 50,000 Argentines are abducted, and about 30,000 of them are murdered. Their mutilated bodies are dumped in the South Atlantic Ocean. To give you some idea of the scale of this, Argentina at the time had a population of 25 million. That's about 2/3 the size of Canada's or California's current population. But even in a country that small, there were 10,000 political murders going on a year for a space of 3 years. That is the degree of the state terrorism that we're talking about here when we talk about the dirty war. Perhaps the most amazing thing about the dirty war was that ultimately so many of its perpetrators were brought to justice. After about a quarter century of legal and political wrangling, of elections and threatened coups and amnesties and revoked amnesties, in 2005, actual prosecutions of many of the perpetrators of the dirty war commenced. Close to 3,000 people were charged. Of course, a lot of them had fled the country. Some of them had died in the interim, etc. Some of them got off. These people were afforded all the rights of a criminal accused, and many of them, there were no witnesses left. The only people who were witnesses were co-conspirators, etc. Nevertheless, over 600 of the perpetrators of the dirty war were convicted and were sent to prison. During the course of these trials and prosecutions, certain facts were established. I will mention 4. The Navy Mechanics School served as a venue for 5,000 homicides. A U.S. State Department memo dated May 10, 1979, stated that Argentine General Suarez Mason, another Propaganda 2 man, was signing 50 to 100 death warrants a day, and he had been doing so for a long time. The blonde angel of death, Navy Lieutenant Alfredo Assis, he remained defiant and unapologetic after 86 homicide convictions. Among his victims were nuns whom he forced to pose for photographs draped in revolutionary regalia. These photographs appeared in the newspapers of the day to prove the liberation theology's violent disposition. Jews were 1% of Argentine's population, but 12% of the repression's victims. Jews were forced to kneel and chant, "I love Hitler," in detention centers where the walls were plastered with Hitler posters and where the loudspeakers blared Hitler speeches. So many of the guards spoke fluent German. One of the victims, at least one of the few that survived, recalled wondering what country he was in. The word complicity does not do justice to the red-handed participation of Argentine bishops in this atrocity. The ruling military clique held regular meetings with the bishops. Interviewed from prison, General Videla said that the church was fully informed of what he then referred to as the murders, and that the church had helped with public relations. Armed Forces Vicar, Archbishop Adolfo Tortolo, secured an agreement whereby the military, this is on the eve of the coup, March 23, 1976, he secures an agreement whereby the military would, before abducting a priest or a nun, contact that priest or nun's supervising bishop. 150 priests and nuns disappeared, mutilated corpses dumped in the South Atlantic, which means that on 150 occasions, a bishop had signed off on it. Archbishop Tortolo personally sanctified torture. However, he joked that he didn't want them to use electric shocks because he thought that would be a waste of electricity. The Archbishop's personal secretary, who was very much the go-to man, was Father Alberto Escuro, who you will recall was with Joe Baxter, the co-founder of the neo-Nazi group Takura. Escura was a man who loved to tattoo swastikas onto the faces of kidnapped Jews. Bishops gave lists of dissidents to the junta. Bishops gave the victims' families fictionalized accounts of the goings-on inside the detention centers. Bishops let the Navy stash inmates on a church-owned island while the Navy Mechanics School was being inspected by human rights investigators. Bishops scolded inmates, they praised the military, and they frequently denied the disappearances were even happening. Of 84 bishops, only 4 condemned the repression, and 2 of them got assassinated for condemning the repression. One of them was machine-gunned in his car on the way home from delivering a eulogy for another Catholic official who had been murdered. Pope Paul VI backed the junta. John Paul II flew to Buenos Aires to kiss generals and snub the victims' families. And the Vatican's official ambassador to Argentina was Admiral Emilio Macera's tennis partner. Each detention center was assigned a priest who had 3 functions. They were to help the perpetrators of the violence overcome their pangs of conscience. They were to do the ritual blessings of comatose bodies that were slated for execution. And they were to use the rite of confession, remembering most of the victims were Catholics. They were to use the rite of confession to extract information from people while they were being interrogated. Witnesses place Father Christian von Wernick inside torture chambers during torture sessions at 3 detention centers. Years later, investigators caught up with Christian von Wernick. He was working as a priest in a sleepy seaside Chilean town. He was extradited back to Argentina, where he was convicted of 7 homicides, 42 kidnappings, and 32 instances of torture. Great backdrop. But he was never defrocked. He officiated Mass from inside prison. Investigators believe there were at least 30 priests who were actually physically involved in torture. Many of the victims, at least those that survive, recall one of the favorite slogans of the torturers was, "Long live Christ the King." Witnesses recall that Provincial Superior Bergoglio liked to gab enthusiastically about Admiral Macera's mission. Bergoglio was unusually well informed about impending military sweeps. He never publicly denounced the repression. He privately supported it. This brings us to the tale of Fathers Orlando Yorio and Francisco Jalix. They were Jesuit priests, hence they answered to Provincial Superior Bergoglio. They were also liberation theologians who had set up a slum parish inside a ghetto in Buenos Aires with the help of a dozen or so lay